Hello there. Tonight, we step into something most people spend their entire lives avoiding, not out of fear, but because of how quiet it truly is. Death is often imagined as something dramatic, something loud, something overwhelming. But in reality, it is none of those things. It is slow, it is silent, and in many ways, it is deeply calm. What you are about to hear is not fiction, not speculation, and not comfort disguised as mystery. It is the closest understanding science and human observation can offer of what truly happens in the final moments and beyond them. From the last breath, to the fading of awareness, to the quiet journey of the body, and the stillness that follows. This is not meant to disturb you. It is meant to settle your mind, to replace uncertainty with clarity, and to guide you gently into a state where curiosity becomes calm. So as you listen, allow your thoughts to slow down. There is nothing to fear here, only something to understand. And before we begin, if this kind of calm, deeply immersive content helps you relax, helps you think, or helps you drift into sleep, then consider subscribing to this channel. And if you find this video meaningful in any way, a simple like quietly supports the journey and allows more people to find this space. Now, lower the volume of the world around you, let your breathing soften, and step with me into the quiet truth of what happens after death. Chapter 1. The Final Moment. What happens in the last seconds of life? There is a moment, quiet, often unnoticed by the outside world, when life begins to loosen its grip. It is not always dramatic. It is not always filled with struggle. In many cases, it is gradual, almost gentle, like the fading of light at the end of a long day. What happens in those final seconds is not a mystery to science, though it is still deeply humbling. As the body approaches death, the first systems to begin slowing down are often the ones that require the most energy. The brain, despite being only about 2% of the body's weight, consumes nearly 20% of its energy. When oxygen levels begin to fall, the brain is one of the first organs to feel the change. In those last moments, oxygen deprivation, known as hypoxia, starts to affect neural activity. Vision often fades first, not into darkness, but into narrowing clarity. Many people experience what is called tunnel vision, where the edges of sight blur and dim, leaving only a small central field. This happens because the retina and visual cortex are highly sensitive to oxygen loss. At the same time, hearing may remain intact slightly longer. This is why, in many medical settings, it is believed that hearing is one of the last senses to go. Even when a person appears unresponsive, there is a possibility that they can still perceive sound. Calm voices, familiar tones, and gentle words may still reach them. As oxygen continues to drop, the brain's electrical activity begins to change in fascinating ways. Studies using EEG monitoring have shown that just before death, some individuals experience a brief surge of high-frequency brain activity, similar to what is seen during intense focus or even dreaming. This has led some scientists to suggest that the brain, in its final moments, may enter a state of heightened awareness. Time, as perceived by the dying person, may also begin to distort. Seconds can feel longer. Thoughts may appear fragmented or unusually vivid. This distortion is linked to the breakdown of normal neural signaling, especially in areas responsible for memory and perception. The heart, meanwhile, begins to lose its steady rhythm. Blood pressure drops. Circulation slows. Organs that rely on a constant supply of oxygen-rich blood begin to shut down in sequence. The skin may grow cooler, particularly in the extremities like the hands and feet, as the body redirects blood flow toward vital organs in a final attempt to maintain function. Breathing changes as well. It may become irregular, with long pauses between breaths. This pattern, sometimes called Cheyne-Stokes respiration, can appear unsettling to observers, but for the person experiencing it, there is often no sense of distress. In fact, many people report a feeling of calm or detachment as the body slows. One of the more surprising aspects of the dying process is the release of natural chemicals within the brain. Endorphins, chemicals associated with pain relief and well-being, can increase significantly. These may contribute to a sense of peace or even mild euphoria. In some cases, there is also evidence that the brain releases dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, a compound associated with vivid dream-like experiences, though this remains an area of ongoing research. As consciousness begins to fade, the boundary between internal thoughts and external reality can blur. Memories may surface, sometimes in rapid succession. This phenomenon is often described as life flashing before your eyes. While it may not happen in a literal cinematic sequence, the brain's memory networks can activate in unusual ways, bringing emotionally significant moments into awareness. Interestingly, not all deaths are experienced the same way. In cases where death is sudden, such as from cardiac arrest, the loss of consciousness can occur within seconds. The brain, deprived of oxygen, quickly loses the ability to sustain awareness. In these situations, there may be little to no perception of the transition itself. In contrast, when death is gradual, such as in certain illnesses, the body often enters a state of progressive shutdown. Appetite decreases. Sleep increases. The person may drift in and out of awareness, spending more time in a restful inward state. There is also a shift in how the brain processes the sense of self. Regions like the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network, areas associated with identity and self-reflection, begin to lose coherence. This can lead to a feeling of detachment from the body, sometimes described as observing rather than participating. Temperature regulation begins to fail. The body may no longer maintain a stable internal environment. Sweating, chills, or a general sense of warmth can occur, depending on the circumstances. These sensations are part of the body's gradual loss of control over its internal systems. Another subtle change occurs in the way the body handles carbon dioxide. As breathing slows, carbon dioxide levels rise in the blood. This can create a mild sedative effect, contributing further to the sense of calm or drowsiness. It is one of the reasons why, in many cases, the dying process is not experienced as painful in the final moments. Muscle control also diminishes. The body relaxes. Tension fades. This is not a sudden event but a gradual release. As the nervous system loses its ability to send coordinated signals, even the perception of pain changes. As the brain's processing becomes less organized, pain signals may not be interpreted in the usual way. Combined with the release of endorphins, this often results in a reduced awareness of discomfort. One of the most profound aspects of this stage is the transition of consciousness itself. While science can measure brain activity and chemical changes, the subjective experience, the what it feels like, remains largely unknown. However, reports from people who have come close to death suggest that fear is not always present. Instead, there is often a sense of acceptance or even curiosity. The body, in many ways, seems to know how to let go. As the final seconds approach, the electrical activity in the brain diminishes. Neurons, which rely on a constant supply of oxygen and glucose, begin to fail. Signals slow, then stop. The intricate network that once generated thoughts, memories, and awareness gradually falls silent. And yet, in those last fleeting moments, there may be a quiet stillness, a kind of internal pause before everything fades. It is not a single instant, but a process, a transition, a gentle closing of a very long story. As the body continues its quiet descent towards stillness, the boundary between awareness and unconsciousness becomes increasingly delicate. It is not a sudden switch, but rather a gradual dimming, like a candle flame growing softer, thinner, and more distant. In these final moments, the brain enters a state that scientists sometimes describe as disorganized yet strangely active. While overall activity declines, certain regions may briefly flare with bursts of electrical signals. These bursts are not random noise. They are structured enough to suggest that the brain is still attempting to process something. Perhaps memories, sensations, or fragments of perception. One of the lesser-known facts is that, even as consciousness fades, the brainstem, the most primitive part of the brain, continues to function for a short time. This region controls essential functions like breathing and basic reflexes. It is why the body may continue to take occasional breaths even when higher brain functions have already begun to shut down. These final breaths are often irregular, spaced far apart, and sometimes described as soft, sigh-like movements. To an observer, they may seem labored, but internally, they are usually not experienced as distress. The body is no longer interpreting signals in the same way. The urgency that once defined breathing has dissolved. At the cellular level, a quiet but profound shift is taking place. Every cell in the body depends on a constant supply of oxygen to produce energy. Without it, cells begin to switch to anaerobic metabolism, a less efficient process that quickly leads to the buildup of lactic acid. This creates an acidic environment inside the body, further accelerating cellular shutdown. Neurons, in particular, are extremely sensitive to this change. Within minutes of oxygen deprivation, they begin to lose their ability to maintain electrical balance. Ion channels fail. Electrical gradients collapse. Communication between neurons becomes fragmented, then ceases altogether. Yet, in a fascinating twist, some studies suggest that just before this complete shutdown, the brain may produce a final coordinated wave of activity. In animal studies, researchers have observed a surge of gamma waves, patterns associated with awareness and perception. While it is not fully understood whether humans experience the same phenomenon, it raises an intriguing possibility that the brain, in its final moments, may briefly unify its activity in a last, coherent state. Time perception, already distorted, may stretch even further. A single moment could feel expansive, almost timeless. This is not because time itself has changed, but because the brain's ability to measure and sequence events is breaking down. Without that structure, experience becomes fluid, unanchored. Another subtle but important change occurs in the sense of identity. The self, as we normally experience it, depends on a network of brain regions working together. As these networks lose synchronization, the sense of being a distinct individual may begin to dissolve. Some people who have come close to death describe this as a feeling of merging with something larger, or simply no longer feeling confined to their physical body. At the same time, sensory input from the outside world fades almost completely. The eyes, no longer receiving or processing light effectively, cease to provide meaningful information. Touch becomes distant. Even sound, which often lingers the longest, eventually fades into silence as the auditory pathways shut down. Internally, however, the brain may still be generating experiences. Dreams or dreamlike states can occur even in the absence of external input. This is because the brain is capable of creating entire worlds from memory and imagination alone. In the final moments, these internally generated experiences may become the dominant form of awareness. The heart, now weakened, may enter arrhythmia, an irregular pattern that signals the loss of coordinated function. Eventually, it stops altogether. When the heart ceases to beat, blood flow to the brain drops to zero. Within seconds, the remaining electrical activity begins to fade rapidly. And yet, death is not always instantaneous at this point. There is a brief window, often measured in seconds to a few minutes, where residual activity can still be detected. During this time, the brain is in its final stage of shutdown. One of the most calming aspects of this process is the body's natural tendency towards sedation. As carbon dioxide levels rise and oxygen levels fall, the brain shifts into a state similar to deep sleep. Conscious awareness slips away gently, without a clear boundary. There is no sharp moment of ending from the inside, only a gradual absence. Muscles, now fully relaxed, release completely. The body becomes still. The tension that once held posture, movement, and expression dissolves entirely. This relaxation is not forced. It is simply the absence of signals that once maintained it. Interestingly, even after clinical death, defined as the stopping of the heart and breathing, some cells in the body continue to function for a short time. Skin cells, for example, can remain alive for hours. Hair and nails do not grow, as commonly believed, but the skin around them may retract, creating the illusion of growth. Within the brain, however, the situation is more delicate. Without oxygen, neurons begin to undergo irreversible damage within minutes. This is why, in medical emergencies, restoring circulation quickly is critical. But when death is final, this damage marks the end of the brain's ability to generate consciousness. There is also a quiet shift in the body's chemistry. Hormones that once regulated stress, alertness, and emotion are no longer produced in meaningful amounts. The intricate balance that sustained life dissolves into stillness. What remains at the very end is not a dramatic event, but a complete absence of activity. The electrical signals that once formed thoughts, feelings, and awareness have ceased. The body, which once moved, responded, and interacted with the world, has become still. And yet, from a broader perspective, this moment is not an abrupt disappearance. It is a transition from one state to another. The processes that defined life have ended, but the components, the atoms, the energy, the physical matter remain. The final moment, then, is less like a door slamming shut and more like a quiet fading of sound, a gradual softening, until there is nothing left to hear. For those observing from the outside, it may appear as a single point in time. But from within, if it can be experienced at all, it is likely something far more subtle. A gentle release, a drifting away, a closing of awareness that feels less like an ending and more like slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep. And in that stillness, the long journey of a single life reaches its quiet conclusion. Chapter 2: The Body After Death. The quiet science of physical change. After the final breath has passed and the last electrical signals in the brain have faded, the body enters a different kind of existence. It is no longer alive in the way we understand life, yet it does not immediately become still in every sense. Instead, a series of quiet, natural processes begin, slow, methodical, and deeply governed by the laws of biology and chemistry. In the first moments after death, the body undergoes what is known as primary flexidity. Muscles throughout the body relax completely. This includes not only the limbs but also the face, the jaw, and even the small muscles responsible for posture and expression. The tension that once held the body upright disappears entirely, leaving a softness that is both physical and visible. At the same time, the heart has stopped, and with it, circulation. Blood is no longer being pumped through the body. Without movement, gravity begins to take over. Blood slowly settles in the lowest parts of the body, a process known as livor mortis or postmortem lividity. This can create a subtle purplish or reddish discoloration on the skin, depending on the position of the body. This shift does not happen instantly. It unfolds over the course of hours. At first, the discoloration is faint and can still be altered if the body is moved. But as time passes, it becomes fixed, marking the quiet influence of gravity even after life has ended. Meanwhile, another process begins, algor mortis, or the gradual cooling of the body. While alive, the human body maintains a stable internal temperature, usually around 37 degrees Celsius. After death, this regulation stops. The body begins to cool, slowly adjusting to the temperature of its surroundings. The rate of cooling is not constant. It depends on many factors: the environment, clothing, body size, and even air movement. In a cool room, the body may lose heat more quickly. In a warmer environment, the process slows. On average, the body loses about 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius per hour, but this is only a general guideline. As the body cools, the skin may feel cold to the touch, but internally, deeper tissues retain warmth for longer. This creates a gradient, cool on the surface, warmer beneath, until eventually equilibrium is reached. Within a few hours, another change begins to emerge: rigor mortis. This is the gradual stiffening of the muscles. It may seem contradictory after the initial relaxation, but it is part of a natural sequence. During life, muscles contract and relax using energy stored in the form of ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. After death, ADP production stops. Without it, muscles become locked in place. Rigor mortis typically begins in the smaller muscles, such as those in the face and jaw, before spreading to larger muscle groups. The body becomes progressively stiffer over several hours, reaching a peak around 12 hours after death. Eventually, as decomposition advances, the stiffness fades, and the muscles relax once again. At the cellular level, an even more intricate process is unfolding. Cells, deprived of oxygen and nutrients, begin to break down. This process is called autolysis or self-digestion. Enzymes that were once carefully contained within cellular structures are released, starting to break apart proteins, membranes, and internal components. This is not a violent process. It is quiet, gradual, and entirely natural. The body, in a sense, begins to return to its basic chemical elements. One of the earliest organs affected by autolysis is the pancreas. Rich in digestive enzymes, it begins to break down quickly. The liver follows, then other internal organs. The process spreads outward, slowly altering the structure of tissues. At the same time, bacteria that were once part of the body's normal ecosystem begin to play a new role. The human body contains trillions of microorganisms, many of which live in the gut. During life, the immune system keeps these populations in balance. After death, that control is gone. These bacteria begin to multiply and spread, contributing to putrefaction, the process of decomposition driven by microbial activity. As they break down tissues, gases are produced, such as methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. These gases can accumulate, leading to subtle changes in the body's appearance. Interestingly, this process is not immediate. It takes time for bacterial activity to build. In the early hours after death, the body remains relatively unchanged on the surface. The deeper transformations are happening quietly, beneath the skin. Another lesser-known fact is that certain cells in the body remain alive for a short period after death. Skin cells, for example, can survive for several hours. Some types of stem cells may remain viable even longer under the right conditions. This is why organ transplantation is possible. Organs can still function if they are preserved and transplanted quickly. The eyes also undergo noticeable changes. The cornea, which depends on oxygen from the air and tear film, begins to lose its clarity. If the eyes remain open, a thin film may form on the surface within a few hours. If closed, the process is slower. Pupils, which once responded to light, become fixed. This is because the muscles controlling them no longer receive signals from the brain. The eyes, like the rest of the body, are no longer part of an active system. The skin may begin to change in texture as well. Without circulation, it loses its natural color and elasticity. It may appear pale or slightly waxy. Over time, as fluids shift and tissues break down, the skin can become more fragile. Hair and nails, contrary to common belief, do not continue to grow after death. What creates this illusion is the dehydration of the skin. As the skin recedes slightly, more of the hair and nails become visible, giving the appearance of growth. Even in stillness, the body is not entirely silent. Small movements can sometimes occur, caused by the release of gases or the contraction of muscles during the early stages of rigor mortis. These movements are not signs of life, but rather the result of physical processes continuing in the absence of control. Temperature, gravity, chemistry, and time all begin to shape the body in new ways. And yet, despite these changes, there is a certain calmness to the process. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is chaotic. Each step follows a predictable path, guided by the same natural laws that governed life itself. In a way, the body is not resisting this transformation. It is simply following its design. The systems that once worked tirelessly to maintain balance have stopped, and now a different kind of balance begins to emerge, one that belongs not to life but to nature as a whole. The transition is quiet, steady, and deeply connected to the world around it. As time continues to pass, the changes within the body become more visible, though they still unfold with a quiet, almost patient rhythm. Nothing happens abruptly. Each transformation follows the one before it, guided by temperature, environment, and the delicate balance of microorganisms that now begin to shape the body's return to the earth. In the hours after death, livor mortis becomes more pronounced. The areas where blood has settled deepen in color, shifting from faint pink tones to darker purples and reds. This is not just a visual change. It reflects the stillness of circulation. Without the heart's movement, blood has found its final resting place within the body. At the same time, rigor mortis reaches its peak. The body is now firm, the muscles locked in place due to the absence of energy molecules. This stiffness can create a sense of stillness that feels almost sculptural, as though the body has paused mid-motion. Yet this phase, like all others, is temporary. Over the next day or two, the chemical bonds within muscle fibers begin to break down, and the stiffness gradually fades. One of the more subtle changes involves the internal chemistry of the body. As cells continue to break apart through autolysis, fluids begin to leak into surrounding tissues. This can cause slight swelling, particularly in areas where tissues are softer. The body is no longer maintaining its internal boundaries in the same way. It is becoming more fluid, more diffuse. Meanwhile, bacterial activity increases steadily. The microorganisms that once lived quietly within the digestive system now spread into surrounding tissues. This marks the beginning of more advanced putrefaction. As bacteria break down proteins, they produce gases that slowly accumulate within the body. These gases can cause gentle expansion, particularly in the abdomen. The process is gradual, not sudden, and it varies widely depending on environmental conditions. In cooler environments, decomposition slows significantly. In warmer conditions, it progresses more quickly. Temperature plays a central role in everything that follows. In a warm, humid climate, bacterial activity is more active, and the body's transformation accelerates. In colder environments, these processes can be delayed, sometimes for days or even weeks. Nature adjusts the pace, but the sequence remains the same. Another lesser-known fact is the presence of microorganisms in the surrounding environment. After death, external bacteria, fungi, and even insects begin to interact with the body. This is not immediate in all cases, but over time, it becomes an important part of decomposition. In natural settings, insects such as flies may be among the first to arrive. They are drawn by chemical signals released during the early stages of decomposition. These signals are not something we consciously perceive, but they are part of a complex ecological system that ensures the recycling of organic matter. As these organisms interact with the body, they contribute to the breakdown of tissues. This is not destruction in a chaotic sense, it is transformation. The body is being returned piece by piece to the environment from which it originally came. Internally, organs continue to lose their structure. The liver, brain, and other soft tissues break down more quickly than bones or connective tissue. This is because they contain higher amounts of water and enzymes, making them more susceptible to both autolysis and bacterial action. The brain, in particular, undergoes rapid change. Within hours, its delicate structure begins to soften. This is one of the reasons why, from a biological perspective, consciousness cannot return once death has fully progressed. The physical structures required to support it no longer exist in the same form. As decomposition advances, the body begins to release fluids. These are the result of cellular breakdown and the accumulation of gases. The release is gradual and varies depending on the environment and conditions. The skin, which once served as a protective barrier, begins to lose its integrity. Layers separate. Blisters may form as gases and fluids build beneath the surface. Over time, the outer layers may peel away, revealing deeper tissues. Despite how this may sound, the process remains methodical and governed by natural laws. It is not chaotic, it is organized in its own quiet way. Another interesting aspect is the role of oxygen, or rather, the lack of it. In the absence of oxygen, certain types of bacteria, known as anaerobic bacteria, become more active. These organisms thrive in low oxygen environments and play a key role in decomposition. They produce many of the gases associated with the process, contributing to both internal changes and external signs. As days pass, the body continues to change in composition. Proteins break down into amino acids, fats into fatty acids and glycerol, and carbohydrates into simpler sugars. These molecules are then further processed by microorganisms, eventually becoming part of the surrounding soil or environment. Bones, which are more resistant, remain long after soft tissues have decomposed. They are composed largely of calcium phosphate, giving them strength and durability. Over time, even bones can break down, though this process may take years or even decades depending on environmental conditions. One of the most calming perspectives on this entire process is its role in the larger cycle of life. The elements that make up the human body, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, calcium, do not disappear. They are simply redistributed. These elements may become part of the soil, nourishing plants. They may enter the atmosphere as gases, becoming part of the air. They may be taken up by microorganisms, continuing the chain of life in forms too small to see. Even water within the body follows this path. It evaporates, seeps into the ground, or becomes part of other living systems. Nothing is wasted. Everything is transformed. Another lesser discussed fact is that decomposition does not occur at a uniform rate throughout the body. Some areas change more quickly than others, depending on tissue type, moisture levels, and bacterial presence. This creates a mosaic of transformation, where different parts of the body are at different stages simultaneously. In certain environments, such as very dry or very cold conditions, decomposition can slow to the point where the body becomes preserved. This can result in natural mummification or freezing, where the usual processes are paused. Even then, the underlying chemistry remains the same. It is simply delayed. Over time, the body becomes less recognizable as a human form. This is not a loss, but a transition into something more elemental. The identity that once defined the body is no longer tied to its physical structure. And yet, there is something profoundly consistent about the entire process. It follows patterns that have existed for millions of years. Every living organism, from the smallest microbe to the largest animal, eventually returns to the same cycle. The body, once full of motion and awareness, becomes part of a larger system, one that does not end, but continues in different forms. There is no urgency in this transformation. It unfolds at its own pace, guided by temperature, environment, and time. Each stage leads naturally into the next without resistance. In this way, even after death, the body remains connected to the world, not as a living being, but as part of an ongoing process that sustains life itself. And in that quiet transformation, there is a certain kind of balance, a steady, unbroken rhythm that continues long after the final breath has passed. Chapter 3: The Brain's Final Echo. Consciousness at the Edge of Death. There is a quiet mystery at the center of every human life: consciousness. It is the invisible thread that carries thoughts, memories, identity, and awareness. And as the body approaches death, this thread does not simply snap. It begins to loosen, slowly, subtly, in ways that science is only beginning to understand. In the final moments of life, the brain does not go silent immediately. Instead, it passes through a series of complex transitions, each one revealing something profound about how awareness itself is created. This has led researchers to consider a fascinating possibility: that the brain, in its final moments, may enter a state of heightened internal experience. Not necessarily clearer in a logical sense, but more intense, more vivid, perhaps even more unified than ordinary waking consciousness. At the same time, the brain's sensory systems begin to detach from the external world. The visual cortex, deprived of oxygen, starts to lose its ability to process incoming light. This can result in fading vision, flashes of light, or even complex visual patterns generated internally. The auditory system, however, often persists slightly longer. This means that sounds, especially familiar voices, may still be perceived even when other senses have diminished. It is one of the reasons why, in many cultures and medical practices, speaking gently to someone in their final moments is considered meaningful. As external input fades, the brain turns inward, Memory networks, particularly those involving the hippocampus and surrounding regions, can become highly active. This may explain why some individuals report vivid recollections or a sense of reviewing past experiences. These are not necessarily ordered or chronological, but they often carry emotional significance. Emotion itself undergoes a transformation. The amygdala, a region involved in processing fear and stress, may become less active as oxygen levels drop and endorphins rise. This can reduce feelings of anxiety, replacing them with a sense of calm or detachment. Another important factor is the role of carbon dioxide. As breathing slows, carbon dioxide levels in the blood increase. This has a sedative effect on the brain, similar in some ways to the onset of sleep. Consciousness begins to soften, becoming less sharp, less defined. As the brain continues its gradual descent towards stillness, the patterns of activity become softer, less coordinated, and increasingly fragmented. Yet within this fading landscape, there are still moments, brief, delicate, where something resembling awareness may linger. One of the most fascinating aspects of this stage is how the brain handles internal imagery. With external sensory input nearly gone, the brain relies entirely on its own stored information. Memory, imagination, and perception begin to blend together, creating experiences that may feel real, even though they are generated from within. This is not unusual for the brain. During dreams, it constructs entire environments without any input from the outside world. At the edge of death, a similar process may occur, but without the structure of normal sleep cycles. The result can be fluid, immersive experiences that are difficult to distinguish from reality. Some researchers believe that this internally driven state may explain reports of vivid scenes during near-death situations. People have described seeing familiar places, hearing voices, or experiencing a sense of movement. These experiences are likely tied to the activation of memory networks and sensory regions working together in unusual ways. Another important change involves the brain's ability to filter information. Under normal conditions, the brain constantly selects which signals to prioritize and which to ignore. As this filtering system breaks down, more signals may enter awareness simultaneously. This can create a sense of intensity or fullness, where multiple impressions overlap. At the same time, the brain's electrical activity becomes less synchronized. Neurons that once fired in coordinated patterns begin to lose their timing. This loss of synchronization reduces the brain's ability to generate coherent thoughts or sustained awareness. And yet, paradoxically, there may still be moments of temporary organization. Some studies suggest that just before complete shutdown, the brain can produce brief, highly ordered patterns of activity. These patterns are not fully understood, but they may represent the brain's final attempts to maintain integration. Time perception continues to shift in profound ways. Without consistent neural processing, the brain cannot measure time in the usual sense. Moments may feel extended, or they may pass without any sense of duration at all. The experience becomes detached from the linear flow of time. Another subtle but meaningful change is the reduction of self-referential thinking. The inner voice, the constant stream of thoughts that defines much of our waking experience, begins to fade. This is linked to the decline of the default mode network, which plays a central role in maintaining the sense of self. As this network loses coherence, awareness may become less centered. Instead of feeling like I am here, there may be a more diffuse sense of presence, or simply a quiet absence of identity. Emotion, too, continues to shift. The brain's stress response is no longer active in the same way. Without the usual triggers and processing pathways, fear and anxiety often diminish. This is supported by both biological changes, such as the release of endorphins, and by the reduced activity in regions associated with threat detection. This does not mean that every experience is peaceful, but there is a strong tendency toward calmness as the brain's systems wind down. Another lesser-known fact is the role of electrical silence. As neurons lose their ability to maintain charge differences across their membranes, they gradually stop firing. This leads to a state where large areas of the brain become electrically inactive. This silence is not immediate. It spreads gradually, like a dimming field of light. Some regions go quiet first, while others remain active for a short time longer. Eventually, however, the entire network falls silent. During this transition, the brain's ability to generate new experiences disappears. Without active neural signaling, there is no mechanism for creating thoughts, sensations, or awareness. What remains is not an experience, but an absence. From a scientific perspective, this marks the end of consciousness. However, the exact boundary is still difficult to define. Because the process is gradual, there is no single moment that can be identified as the precise end of awareness. Instead, it is more like a fading signal becoming weaker and weaker until it is no longer detectable. Another interesting aspect is how the brain's energy reserves are used. Even as oxygen levels drop, the brain continues to consume its remaining energy stores. This allows for a short period of continued activity, even in the absence of fresh oxygen. Once these reserves are depleted, activity declines rapidly. In certain rare cases, medical interventions can restore circulation during this window, leading to the return of brain function. This is the basis for resuscitation techniques. However, if circulation is not restored within a critical time frame, the damage becomes irreversible. At the microscopic level, neurons begin to undergo structural changes. Cell membranes lose integrity. Internal components break down. These changes prevent the cells from functioning, even if oxygen were to be restored later. Despite this, the process remains quiet. There is no sensation associated with the loss of these functions. The brain, no longer capable of generating awareness, cannot perceive its own shutdown. One of the most calming interpretations of this process is that it resembles the transition into deep, dreamless sleep. In deep sleep, consciousness is absent, yet the experience is not one of distress. It is simply a state of non-awareness. The final stages of brain activity may be similar in this regard, a gentle slipping away, rather than a sudden disappearance. Even after clinical death, scientists have detected very low levels of residual electrical activity for short periods. These signals are not organized enough to support consciousness, but they highlight the gradual nature of the process. The brain, in its final moments, does not collapse instantly. It unwinds. And as it unwinds, the complex patterns that once formed thoughts, memories, and identity dissolve into stillness. There is no sharp boundary, no clear line where everything stops. Instead, there is a gradual quieting, a soft fading of activity until there is nothing left to sustain awareness. What remains, from a biological perspective, is a system that has completed its function. The intricate network that once allowed a person to think, feel, and experience the world has reached its natural conclusion. And in that conclusion, there is a kind of quiet symmetry. The same processes that once gave rise to consciousness now gently bring it to an end. Not abruptly, not violently, but slowly, softly, and without resistance. Chapter 4: Near-Death Experiences. What people report beyond the threshold. There are moments when the boundary between life and death becomes uncertain, when the body is no longer functioning normally, yet consciousness has not fully disappeared. In these rare and fragile states, some people report experiences that feel vivid, structured, and deeply meaningful. These are known as near-death experiences, often described quietly, sometimes hesitantly, but with a consistency that has drawn the attention of scientists and doctors for decades. What makes these accounts so compelling is not just their intensity, but how often they share similar patterns across cultures, ages, and backgrounds. One of the most commonly reported elements is a sense of detachment from the body. Individuals describe feeling as though they are no longer confined within their physical form. Instead, they may perceive themselves as floating above or observing from a distance. This is sometimes referred to as an out-of-body experience. From a neurological perspective, this sensation may be linked to the temporoparietal junction, a region of the brain involved in integrating sensory information and constructing the sense of self within the body. When this region is disrupted, due to lack of oxygen or unusual neural activity, it can alter the perception of physical boundaries. Another frequently described feature is the perception of moving through a dark space or tunnel, often toward a distant light. This experience is reported with remarkable consistency, even among individuals who have never heard of such accounts before. Scientists suggest that this may be related to how the visual system responds to oxygen deprivation. As the outer regions of the visual field shut down first, vision can narrow, creating a tunnel-like effect. At the same time, internal activity in the visual cortex may generate the perception of light. Yet, for those who experience it, the sensation often feels more than just visual. It is described as a movement, a transition, as though being gently drawn forward. Another commonly reported phenomenon is the experience of reviewing one's life. Individuals describe seeing or reliving moments from their past, sometimes in rapid succession, sometimes with a sense of clarity that feels different from ordinary memory. This is not necessarily a structured replay of events. Instead, it often involves emotionally significant moments, interactions, decisions, or experiences that carried meaning. These memories may appear interconnected, forming a kind of narrative that feels complete, even if it unfolds quickly. From a scientific standpoint, this may be linked to the activation of memory networks in the brain, particularly the hippocampus and associated regions. Under stress, these networks can become highly active, retrieving information in unusual ways. Time perception during these experiences is also altered. What might take only seconds in real time can feel much longer. This distortion is likely due to changes in how the brain processes and sequences events. Another interesting aspect is the clarity of thought reported by some individuals. Despite the extreme physical state, they describe a sense of awareness that feels sharp or heightened. This may be related to the bursts of synchronized brain activity observed in some studies. However, not all near-death experiences are identical. While many share common features, there is also variation. Some people report simple sensations, darkness, quiet, or a sense of drifting. Others describe more complex scenes or interactions. Cultural background can influence how these experiences are interpreted. For example, the presence of familiar figures or symbols may reflect personal beliefs or memories. Yet, the underlying structure, the sense of transition, detachment, and altered perception, remains strikingly similar. Another lesser-known fact is that near-death experiences are not limited to situations where the heart has stopped. They can also occur during severe trauma, extreme stress, or even certain medical procedures. What these situations have in common is a disruption of normal brain function. This suggests that the experiences are closely tied to how the brain responds under extreme conditions, rather than to death itself. There is also evidence that the brain's default mode network, which helps maintain the sense of self, becomes less active during these states. This may contribute to the feeling of losing personal boundaries or merging with the surrounding environment. At the same time, sensory input from the outside world is greatly reduced. This allows internal processes, memories, imagery, and emotions to become more prominent. One of the most calming aspects of these reports is the consistent presence of peace. While not universal, it is a common theme. The brain, facing extreme conditions, may create a state that is not defined by fear, but by quiet acceptance. As the body approaches its limits, the mind does not always respond with panic. Instead, it may shift into a state that feels distant, gentle, and deeply internal. And in that state, the boundaries between reality and perception become softer, less defined, and more open to interpretation. As these experiences continue to be studied, a deeper pattern begins to emerge, not just in what people see or feel, but in how consistently the mind seems to respond when it is pushed to the very edge of survival. There is a quiet structure beneath the variety, a kind of shared language of perception that appears across different individuals, even when their lives have been completely different. One of the more subtle elements reported is the sense of effortless movement. People often describe drifting, gliding, or being gently pulled forward without any physical exertion. There is no sense of weight, no resistance, and no awareness of the body as something separate. Movement feels natural, almost automatic, as though intention alone is enough to change direction or location. This may be connected to the brain's motor systems becoming disconnected from the physical body. Without feedback from muscles and joints, the brain is no longer grounded in physical sensation. Instead, it may generate a simplified sense of motion based on internal signals. Another recurring feature is the presence of sound, or more precisely, the transformation of it. Some individuals describe hearing a low hum, a soft ringing, or a distant vibration. Others report silence that feels unusually complete, as though all external noise has been removed. These auditory changes may be linked to how the brain processes sound when oxygen levels drop. The auditory cortex can produce internal signals even in the absence of external input, creating sensations that feel real but originate entirely within the brain. There are also reports of encountering figures or presences. These are often described as familiar, sometimes recognized as loved ones, sometimes as unknown but comforting entities. The experiences vary widely, but the emotional tone is often calm and reassuring. From a scientific perspective, these perceptions may arise from memory networks activating in combination with emotional processing centers. The brain, drawing from stored experiences, may generate images that feel meaningful and personal. Another interesting aspect is the sense of communication without words. Some individuals report understanding messages or ideas without hearing them spoken. This can feel like direct knowledge, as though information is simply known rather than conveyed. This phenomenon may be related to the brain's ability to process complex ideas without relying on language. In certain states, especially when the prefrontal cortex is less active, thoughts may appear more holistic and less structured by words. Time once again behaves in unusual ways. Some people describe their experiences as lasting a long time, even though only seconds or minutes have passed in reality. Others report a complete absence of time, where events seem to occur all at once. This distortion reflects the breakdown of the brain's internal clock mechanisms. Without consistent neural signaling, The brain cannot organize events into a linear sequence. Experience becomes fluid, without clear beginning or end. Another lesser-known detail is the role of visual clarity. Some individuals report seeing with unusual sharpness or brightness, even if their physical vision was impaired before the experience. Colors may appear more vivid, and details more defined. This may be linked to the brain's internal visual processing becoming more dominant. Without competing input from the eyes, internally generated imagery can appear more intense and focused. Not all near-death experiences are positive, though. A smaller number of people report confusion, discomfort, or a sense of disorientation. These variations highlight that the brain's response is not uniform. It depends on many factors, including the cause of the near-death state, the individual's physiology, and their mental condition at the time. However, even in these cases, the experiences are often described as brief and lacking the sustained fear that might be expected. The brain's changing chemistry still tends to reduce prolonged distress. Another important observation is that near-death experiences often include a sense of boundary or threshold. People describe reaching a point, sometimes a line, a gate, or simply a feeling beyond which they cannot go. This is often followed by a return to normal consciousness. From a biological standpoint, this may correspond to the moment when brain activity begins to recover, or when external intervention restores circulation and oxygen. The sense of a boundary may be the mind's way of interpreting this transition. Memory of these experiences can be unusually vivid. Unlike dreams, which often fade quickly, near-death experiences are frequently remembered in detail for years, sometimes for a lifetime. This suggests that the brain may encode these memories differently, possibly due to the intense emotional and neurological conditions under which they occur. Another subtle detail is the absence of ordinary physical needs. Hunger, thirst, and pain are rarely reported during these experiences. This reflects the brain's shift away from processing bodily signals and toward internal activity. There is also evidence that certain neurotransmitters, such as serotonin and dopamine, may play a role in shaping these experiences. These chemicals influence mood, perception, and the sense of reward, potentially contributing to the feelings of peace or clarity. One of the more common interpretations of near-death experiences is that they reflect the brain's ability to create a protective state. In extreme conditions, rather than amplifying fear, the brain may shift toward a state that reduces distress and promotes a sense of acceptance. This does not mean that the experience is intentionally designed, but it does suggest that the brain has mechanisms that can soften the perception of danger. Another point worth noting is that similar experiences can sometimes be induced under controlled conditions, such as through certain medications or during specific neurological events. This further supports the idea that near-death experiences are rooted in brain function, rather than external phenomena. Even so, the consistency of these reports remains remarkable. Across different cultures and time periods, people describe similar patterns: detachment, movement, light, memory, and calmness. This consistency suggests that there may be fundamental features of the human brain that shape these experiences in predictable ways. As the brain approaches the limits of its function, it does not simply shut down in silence. Instead, it may pass through a phase of altered perception, one that feels vivid, immersive, and deeply personal. And then, as the process continues, these experiences fade. The internal imagery softens, the sense of movement slows, the impressions that once felt so clear begin to dissolve. What remains is a gradual quieting, a return to stillness. From the outside, it may appear as a simple loss of consciousness. But from within, if it is experienced at all, it may be something far more intricate, a final sequence of perceptions shaped by the brain's last moments of activity. And in that sequence, there is often not fear, but a gentle sense of transition. Chapter 5. What happens to awareness? Scientific theories of consciousness after death. When the body becomes still and the brain's activity fades into silence, a deeper question begins to emerge, one that has been asked quietly across centuries. What happens to awareness itself? Science approaches this question carefully, grounding its answers in observation, evidence, and measurable processes. And from this perspective, consciousness is not something separate from the brain, but something that arises from it, an emergent property of complex neural activity. In simple terms, awareness exists because the brain is active. It is created by patterns of electrical signals, chemical exchanges, and coordinated networks that work together in real time. When these patterns are present, consciousness exists. When they are not, it does not. One of the most widely accepted scientific views is that consciousness depends on the integration of information across different regions of the brain. No single area is responsible for awareness. Instead, it emerges from the interaction between many systems: sensory processing, memory, attention, and self-reflection. This idea is supported by theories such as the integrated information theory, which suggests that consciousness corresponds to the brain's ability to combine information into a unified whole. When this integration is high, awareness is present. When it breaks down, consciousness fades. Another influential model is the global workspace theory, which describes consciousness as a kind of mental stage. Information becomes conscious when it is broadcast across multiple brain regions, allowing different systems to access and process it simultaneously. In both theories, the key element is activity, ongoing, coordinated activity within the brain. As death approaches and this activity declines, the processes that generate awareness begin to fail. The networks lose synchronization. Communication between regions weakens. Eventually, the integration required for consciousness can no longer be sustained. From this perspective, consciousness does not leave the body. It does not travel or move elsewhere. Instead, it simply ceases to be generated. This may sound abrupt, but in reality, the process is gradual. Just as awareness fades when we fall into deep sleep or anesthesia, it likely fades in a similar way during the final stages of life, becoming less defined, less continuous until it is no longer present. One important distinction is between consciousness and the brain itself. The brain is a physical structure made of cells and tissues. Consciousness is a process, a dynamic state that depends on the brain's activity. When the activity stops, the process ends. Another lesser-known fact is that even slight disruptions in brain activity can significantly alter consciousness. Conditions such as sleep, coma, or certain neurological disorders demonstrate how fragile awareness can be. Small changes in neural signaling can lead to profound differences in perception, memory, and identity. This highlights how closely consciousness is tied to the brain's function. Some researchers have explored whether consciousness could exist independently of the brain, but there is currently no scientific evidence to support this idea. All known examples of awareness are linked to functioning neural systems. This does not mean that the question is fully answered. It simply means that, based on current knowledge, consciousness appears to depend entirely on the brain. Another area of research involves the timing of consciousness loss. During cardiac arrest, for example, the brain loses blood flow almost immediately. Within seconds, electrical activity begins to decline. Consciousness is typically lost very quickly, often within 10 to 20 seconds. However, as mentioned earlier, there may still be brief residual activity after this point. The exact relationship between this activity and awareness is not fully understood, but it suggests that the transition is not instantaneous. There is also ongoing research into how the brain behaves during resuscitation. In some cases, individuals who have been revived report memories or impressions from the period when they were clinically unconscious. These reports are carefully studied, though they remain difficult to interpret conclusively. From a scientific standpoint, the most consistent finding is that sustained consciousness requires ongoing brain activity. Without it, there is no mechanism to support awareness. Another perspective comes from the study of information theory. Some scientists view consciousness as a pattern of information processing. In this view, the brain is not just a physical organ, but a system that organizes and processes information in highly complex ways. When the system stops functioning, the patterns it generates, thoughts, memories, identity, also cease. However, the information itself, in a physical sense, is not destroyed. The atoms and molecules that made up the brain remain. The energy that powered neural activity is conserved, as required by the laws of physics. But the specific arrangement, the precise patterns that created a unique conscious experience, no longer exists. This distinction is subtle but important. The components remain, but the organization that gave rise to awareness does not. Another interesting area of discussion involves the concept of emergence. Consciousness is often described as an emergent property, meaning it arises from the interaction of simpler elements. Individual neurons are not conscious, but when billions of them interact in complex ways, consciousness emerges. This is similar to how temperature emerges from the movement of molecules, or how a melody emerges from individual musical notes. When the interactions stop, the emergent property disappears. Some theories also explore the possibility that consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the universe, rather than something produced solely by the brain. These ideas, while intriguing, remain speculative and are not supported by empirical evidence in the same way as brain-based theories. Science, for now, remains grounded in what can be observed and measured. Another calming perspective is that the cessation of consciousness is not experienced as an event. When awareness ends, there is no perception of its absence. Just as we do not experience the time before we were born, there is no experience of non-awareness after consciousness has ceased. This suggests that the end of consciousness is not something that can be felt or observed from within. It is simply the absence of experience. The brain, which once generated a continuous stream of thoughts and sensations, has stopped producing them. And in that stillness, awareness does not continue, it does not move elsewhere, it simply no longer arises. As the discussion of consciousness deepens, it becomes clear that science does not treat awareness as a fixed object, but as a dynamic process. Something that is continuously generated, moment by moment, by the brain's activity. This means that when the brain's activity changes, consciousness changes with it. And when that activity ends, the process that creates awareness also comes to an end. Yet within this understanding, there are still layers of nuance that make the subject both complex and quietly fascinating. One of the most important ideas is that consciousness is not all or nothing. It exists on a spectrum. During waking life, it is vivid and structured. During sleep, it becomes fragmented and dreamlike. Under anesthesia, it can disappear almost entirely. These variations show that awareness can fade gradually, rather than stopping suddenly. At the end of life, a similar fading likely occurs. The brain does not switch off instantly. Instead, different systems lose function at different rates. Sensory processing fades. Memory becomes less accessible. The sense of self becomes less defined. Each of these changes contributes to a gradual reduction in awareness. Another key concept is the role of neural synchronization. Consciousness depends not only on activity, but on coordinated activity. Neurons must fire in patterns that are organized across different regions of the brain. This coordination allows information to be integrated into a unified experience. As death approaches, this synchronization breaks down. Signals become less coordinated. Communication between regions weakens. Without this coordination, the brain cannot sustain the unified patterns required for awareness. This loss of synchronization is not chaotic. It is simply the result of systems losing energy and structure. The brain, which once operated as a highly integrated network, begins to function as isolated fragments, and eventually not at all. Another lesser-known aspect is the role of energy consumption. The brain is one of the most energy-demanding organs in the body. It requires a constant supply of oxygen and glucose to maintain its activity. When this supply is interrupted, the brain must rely on its limited reserves. These reserves allow for a short period of continued activity, but they are quickly depleted. Once they are gone, the processes that sustain consciousness cannot continue. There is also the question of whether any form of awareness could persist in the absence of brain activity. From a scientific perspective, there is currently no evidence to support this possibility. All known forms of consciousness are linked to functioning neural systems. This does not mean that the question is closed. It simply reflects the limits of current understanding. Science can describe what happens to the brain and how consciousness depends on it, but it cannot fully explain why consciousness exists in the first place. This leads to what is sometimes called the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how subjective experience arises from physical processes. While this problem remains unsolved, it does not change the observable relationship between brain activity and awareness. Another perspective comes from comparing consciousness to other processes that depend on structure and activity. For example, a flame exists only while fuel and oxygen are present. When the fuel is gone, the flame does not go somewhere else, it simply stops. Similarly, consciousness may be understood as a process that exists only while the brain's conditions support it. There is also an important distinction between information and experience. The brain contains vast amounts of information, memories, learned skills, and stored knowledge. But this information only becomes experience when it is actively processed. After death, the information may still exist in a physical sense, but it is no longer being processed. Without processing, there is no awareness. Another interesting idea involves the concept of irreversibility. Once the brain has undergone certain levels of damage, particularly due to lack of oxygen, the structures required for consciousness cannot be restored. This marks a point beyond which awareness cannot return. In medical terms, this is often referred to as brain death, a state in which all brain activity has ceased and cannot be restarted. At this point, the conditions necessary for consciousness no longer exist. Despite this, the body may still appear intact for a time. This can create a sense of separation between the physical form and the absence of awareness. However, from a biological perspective, the two are closely linked. Without brain activity, the processes that define a living, aware individual are no longer present. Another common way to understand this is through comparison with deep, dreamless sleep. In such a state, there is no awareness, no sense of time, and no experience of absence. It is not perceived as darkness or emptiness. It is simply nothing. The end of consciousness may be similar in this regard. It is not an experience of nothingness, but the absence of experience altogether. There is also ongoing research into whether any patterns of brain activity persist after clinical death. Some studies have detected brief, low-level signals, but these are not organized in a way that could support awareness. They are more like residual echoes than active processes. These findings reinforce the idea that consciousness depends on sustained, coordinated activity, not just isolated signals. Another important point is that the cessation of consciousness is not something that can be observed from within. Once awareness has ended, there is no perspective from which to experience that ending. This makes it fundamentally different from any other event in life. It is not felt, not perceived, not remembered. It simply does not occur as an experience. From a broader scientific view, this aligns with the understanding that consciousness is a function of the brain. When the function stops, the phenomenon it produces also stops. Yet, even within this framework, there is room for quiet reflection. The fact that consciousness arises at all, from networks of cells and electrical signals, is itself extraordinary. The processes that create awareness are complex, delicate, and deeply interconnected. And when those processes come to an end, they do so in the same way they began, not abruptly but as part of a natural progression. The brain, which once generated a continuous stream of experience, gradually loses the ability to do so. The patterns fade, the signals quiet, the integration dissolves, and in that gentle unwinding, awareness does not continue elsewhere. It simply ceases to be generated, not as a dramatic ending but as a quiet conclusion to a process that, for a time, allowed a single mind to exist. Chapter 6: The Cosmic Perspective. Your atoms after you're gone. When life ends and the body begins its quiet transformation, something remarkable continues. Something far older than any individual life. While awareness fades and biological systems stop, the physical matter that once formed a living person does not disappear. It begins a different journey, one that stretches far beyond the boundaries of a single lifetime. Every human body is made of atoms, tiny building blocks that have existed long before birth and will continue long after death. These atoms are not unique to any one person. They are part of a vast, ongoing cycle that connects all living and non-living things. The carbon in the body, for example, was once part of ancient stars. Billions of years ago, in the intense heat and pressure of stellar cores, elements like carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen were formed through nuclear fusion. When those stars reached the end of their own lifespans, they released these elements into space, where they eventually became part of new stars, planets, and living organisms. In this sense, the atoms that make up a human body are incredibly old. They have traveled across time and space, becoming part of countless forms before arriving in a single life. After death, these atoms do not stop existing. They simply change form. As the body decomposes, complex molecules are broken down into simpler ones. Proteins, fats, and carbohydrates are reduced to their basic components. These components then enter the surrounding environment, becoming part of the soil, the air, and the living systems around them. One of the first stages of this transformation involves the release of carbon dioxide. As microorganisms break down organic matter, they produce gases that return carbon to the atmosphere. This carbon may then be absorbed by plants through photosynthesis, becoming part of new life. In this way, the carbon that was once part of a human body may eventually become part of a tree, a leaf, or another living organism. The cycle continues, not in a symbolic sense, but in a literal, measurable way. Water, which makes up a large portion of the human body, follows a similar path. After death, water is gradually released into the environment. It may evaporate into the air, seep into the ground, or become part of other living systems. This water, like the atoms it contains, is not lost. It becomes part of the Earth's natural cycles, moving through clouds, rain, rivers, and oceans, continuously circulating. Another important element is nitrogen. Found in proteins and DNA, nitrogen is essential for life. After decomposition, nitrogen compounds are released into the soil, where they can be used by plants. These plants may then be consumed by animals, continuing the flow of nutrients through ecosystems. Even calcium, which gives strength to bones, does not remain fixed. Over long periods, it can be dissolved and redistributed, becoming part of the soil or water systems. From a cosmic perspective, nothing is wasted. Every element is reused, reshaped, and reintegrated into the larger system of the Earth. One of the more calming aspects of this process is its consistency. It does not depend on individual circumstances. Whether in a forest, a field, or another environment, the same fundamental processes apply. The body returns to the elements, and those elements continue to participate in the cycles of nature. Another lesser-known fact is that the atoms in the human body are constantly being replaced even during life. Most of the atoms in the body are not the same ones that were present years earlier. Through processes like metabolism and cellular turnover, the body is in a constant state of renewal. This means that even before death, the body is part of a continuous exchange with the environment. After death, this exchange simply continues in a different form. There is also a broader physical principle at work, the conservation of matter and energy. According to the laws of physics, matter cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. The same applies to energy. The energy that once powered the body's functions, movement, thought, and metabolism, is not lost. It is released, dissipated, and redistributed. Heat energy, for example, is transferred to the surrounding environment as the body cools. Chemical energy stored in molecules is released during decomposition, becoming part of other processes. From this perspective, death is not an end of existence at the level of matter and energy. It is a transition from one arrangement to another. Another interesting detail is the scale of this transformation. The human body contains trillions of atoms, each participating in these processes. The complexity of this system is immense, yet it operates without any need for direction or control. It follows natural laws that have been consistent for billions of years. The connection between life and the cosmos becomes clearer when viewed this way. The same elements that form stars and planets also form living organisms. The processes that govern the universe also govern the body. After death, the boundary between the individual and the environment becomes less defined. The body is no longer a separate system. It becomes part of the larger world, contributing to the ongoing cycles that sustain life. Another subtle point is that this transformation is not immediate. It unfolds over time, influenced by environmental conditions. Temperature, moisture, and the presence of other organisms all affect the rate and nature of decomposition. In some cases, such as in very dry or cold environments, the process can slow significantly. In others, it may proceed more quickly. But regardless of the pace, the underlying principles remain the same. The atoms that once formed a living person continue to exist, moving through different forms and systems. There is also a quiet continuity in this process. While the individual life has ended, the material that supported it continues to participate in the broader system of life on Earth. This perspective does not suggest that identity or awareness continues. Instead, it highlights the enduring nature of the physical components that made life possible. In this way, death is not a disappearance of matter, but a redistribution. The body, once organized into a living system, becomes part of a much larger network. One that extends across ecosystems, across time, and even across the universe itself. And within that network, every atom continues its journey. As the transformation continues, the body becomes less recognizable as a single form and more like a collection of elements moving through different pathways. This shift is not sudden, but gradual, guided by time, environment, and the quiet persistence of natural processes that have been unfolding on Earth for billions of years. One of the most profound ideas in this stage is that the body does not leave the Earth. It remains here, but in a different arrangement. The atoms that once formed muscles, skin, and bone begin to integrate into the surrounding world in ways that are both subtle and far-reaching. Carbon, for instance, continues its journey through the carbon cycle. After being released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, it may be absorbed by plants through photosynthesis. Within these plants, carbon becomes part of sugars, fibers, and structural components. If those plants are later consumed, the carbon moves again into animals, into soil, or back into the air. This cycle has no fixed endpoint. It is continuous, looping through different forms over and over again. The same carbon atom may be part of many different living systems over time, each one temporary, each one part of a larger pattern. Water follows a similarly expansive path. Once released from the body, it may evaporate and rise into the atmosphere, forming clouds. It may fall again as rain, becoming part of rivers, lakes, or oceans. It may be absorbed by plants, taken in by animals, or remain in the soil. This movement is part of the water cycle, a global system that connects every part of the planet. The water that was once within a single body becomes part of a much larger circulation, moving across landscapes and through ecosystems. Another element, phosphorus, essential for DNA and cellular energy, enters the phosphorus cycle. Unlike carbon and water, phosphorus does not move through the atmosphere. Instead, it cycles through soil, water, and living organisms. After decomposition, it becomes available to plants, which incorporate it into their tissues, continuing the chain of life. Even trace elements, such as iron and magnesium, follow their own paths. Iron, which once carried oxygen in the blood, may return to the soil and eventually become part of new biological systems. Magnesium, important for cellular function, may be taken up by plants and used in processes like photosynthesis. Each element follows its own route, but together they form a network of cycles that sustain life on Earth. Another lesser-known aspect is the role of microorganisms in guiding these transformations. Bacteria and fungi are not just agents of decomposition, they are essential participants in nutrient cycling. They break down complex molecules into simpler forms, making them available for other organisms. Without these microorganisms, the recycling of nutrients would not occur efficiently. The body's return to the environment depends on their activity, highlighting the interconnectedness of all life forms, even those too small to be seen. Over longer periods, the remains of the body may become part of the soil itself. This soil, enriched with organic material, supports plant growth. Those plants may become part of food chains, transferring energy and nutrients through different levels of life. In this way, the physical components of a single life contribute to the continuation of many others. Another interesting perspective comes from looking at time on a larger scale. While human life is measured in decades, the cycles of matter extend across centuries, millennia, and even longer. The atoms that once formed a body may remain in circulation for vast periods, moving through countless transformations. Some may eventually become part of geological formations. Others may enter the atmosphere and travel across continents. A few may even, over immense spans of time, become part of entirely different systems. This long-term movement connects individual lives to the broader history of the planet. There is also a connection to the universe beyond Earth. While most atoms remain within the planet systems, some processes, such as volcanic activity or atmospheric escape, can move matter beyond the Earth's surface. Over extremely long timescales, atoms can be redistributed on a cosmic level. This perspective places the human body within a much larger context, not just as part of Earth, but as part of the universe itself. Another calming aspect of this view is its sense of continuity. While the individual experience of life has ended, the material that made it possible continues to exist and to participate in ongoing processes. Nothing is isolated. Every element is part of a network that connects past, present, and future. Even the idea of boundaries becomes less defined. The distinction between self and environment is largely a matter of organization. When that organization changes, the boundary dissolves, and the components become part of a larger whole. This does not imply that identity continues, but it does show that the physical substance of life remains active within the world. Another subtle detail is the efficiency of these natural systems. There is no waste in the way matter is handled. Every element is reused, every molecule repurposed. The processes are not random. They follow patterns that have been refined over billions of years. In certain environments, these processes can take on unique forms. In forests, decomposition enriches the soil quickly, supporting dense plant life. In deserts, the process may be slower, influenced by dryness and temperature. In aquatic environments, the pathways differ again, involving water-based systems and organisms. Yet, regardless of the setting, the outcome is the same: the return of matter to the cycles that sustain life. Over time, the body becomes less a distinct entity and more a contribution, a source of nutrients, a collection of elements that continue to move and interact. From this perspective, death is not a removal from the world, but a reintegration into it. The atoms that once formed a single life become part of many other processes, continuing their journey through systems that extend far beyond any one individual. And within that journey, there is a quiet sense of permanence, not of identity, but of existence itself. The matter remains. The energy transforms. The cycles continue. And in that continuity, the story of the physical body does not end. It simply changes form, becoming part of something larger, something ongoing, and something deeply connected to the fabric of the universe. Chapter 7: The Silence Beyond. Philosophical and scientific reflections on death. As the body completes its transformation and the brain's activity fades into stillness, what remains is not an event to observe, but a question to reflect on. Not a question of what is seen or felt, but one of understanding, quiet, steady, and deeply human. Throughout history, people have tried to make sense of death, not only through science, but through philosophy, observation, and introspection. While science explains what happens to the body and brain, philosophy explores what it means, and in doing so, it often returns to the same calm conclusion: that death, in its essence, is not something experienced. One of the most fundamental ideas is simple and often overlooked. For something to be experienced, there must be awareness. Without awareness, there is no perception, no sensation, no passage of time. This means that whatever lies beyond consciousness cannot be felt, feared, or even noticed. In this way, death is not like darkness, silence, or emptiness. Those are experiences, things that can be perceived. Death, from a scientific and philosophical perspective, is the absence of all experience. A useful comparison is the time before birth. There was no awareness of that time, no sense of waiting or absence. It simply was not experienced. Many philosophers have suggested that death may be similar, not as a state that is felt, but as a state in which feeling no longer occurs. This idea can feel abstract, but it carries a certain calmness. If there is no awareness, there is no discomfort, no fear, no sense of loss. The processes that allow those feelings to exist are no longer active. Another perspective comes from the ancient philosopher Epicurus, who argued that death should not be feared because, when we exist, death is not present, and when death is present, we no longer exist. While written centuries ago, this idea aligns closely with modern scientific understanding. It emphasizes a simple truth: fear requires a subject to experience it. Without consciousness, there is no subject and therefore no fear. Another interesting reflection involves the concept of time. During life, time feels continuous, a steady flow from past to present to future. This sense of continuity depends entirely on the brain's ability to process and remember events. When consciousness ends, this continuity disappears. There is no perception of time passing. From the perspective of awareness, there is no after in the way we normally understand it. This can be difficult to grasp because the human mind is built to think in sequences. It naturally imagines what comes next. But in the absence of consciousness, the idea of next no longer applies. Another lesser-known philosophical insight is that much of the fear surrounding death comes not from the state itself, but from the process of imagining it. The mind projects itself into a future where it no longer exists, creating a sense of uncertainty or discomfort. Yet this projection is based on a contradiction, the mind trying to imagine a state where it is absent. When viewed carefully, this reveals that the fear is rooted in thought, not in the reality of the state being considered. From a scientific standpoint, this aligns with what is known about the brain. Fear and anxiety are generated by specific neural circuits, particularly those involving the amygdala. When these circuits are no longer active, the capacity for fear disappears as well. Another calm observation is that death is not an interruption of experience, but the end of it. There is no awareness of being interrupted. Just as falling into deep, dreamless sleep involves no perception of the transition, the end of consciousness may occur without a sense of disruption. This perspective can shift how death is understood, not as something to endure, but as the point where endurance itself is no longer relevant. There is also the idea of completeness. A life, regardless of its length, forms a closed narrative. It has a beginning, a sequence of events, and an end. From a philosophical point of view, the value of that narrative does not depend on its continuation beyond its endpoint. In other words, a story does not lose its meaning because it ends. Its meaning is contained within the experiences that occurred. Another reflection comes from observing nature. Every living system follows a cycle: growth, change, and eventual return to the environment. This cycle is not seen as a failure or a loss, but as a fundamental aspect of existence. The same processes that allow life to emerge also ensure that it does not continue indefinitely. This balance allows new forms of life to arise, maintaining the continuity of ecosystems. From this perspective, death is not separate from life. It is part of the same system. Another subtle idea is the distinction between existence and experience. The physical components of the body continue to exist after death, as discussed earlier. But the experience of being, the awareness that defines a person, does not. This distinction helps clarify why death is not something that can be described in experiential terms. It is not a place, not a state, and not a condition that can be observed from within. It is simply the absence of the processes that make observation possible. Another calming insight is that the human mind often seeks continuity because it is built to recognize patterns. It looks for beginnings and endings, causes and effects. But not all processes fit neatly into these patterns. The end of consciousness is one such process. It does not follow the same rules as events that occur within awareness. It is outside the scope of experience. There is also a quiet symmetry in the idea that the same natural laws that allow consciousness to arise also bring it to an end. The brain, through its complex activity, creates awareness. When that activity stops, awareness stops as well. This is not an external force acting upon the mind, but a natural conclusion of the processes that sustain it. Another reflection involves the concept of identity. During life, identity feels stable and continuous. It is shaped by memory, personality, and experience. But all of these depend on the brain's activity. When that activity ends, the structures that support identity are no longer present. This means that identity does not persist in the absence of the brain. While this may seem like a loss, it also reinforces the idea that identity is not something separate from the body, but something that arises from it. And when the conditions that create it are no longer present, it does not continue. In this way, the silence beyond death is not something to be filled or imagined. It is simply the absence of sound, of thought, of perception. A quiet conclusion to a process that, for a time, allowed awareness to exist. As reflection deepens, the idea of death begins to feel less like a mystery to solve and more like a boundary that quietly defines the experience of being alive. Not something to cross with awareness, but something that gives shape to everything that comes before it. One of the most grounding realizations is that meaning does not depend on permanence. The human mind often seeks continuity, imagining that for something to matter, it must last forever. But this is not how meaning works in any other part of life. A moment can be meaningful even if it is brief. A conversation can matter even if it is never repeated. A life can hold value without extending beyond its natural limits. This idea has been explored by many thinkers, including Marcus Aurelius, who reflected on the transient nature of existence. He observed that everything changes, everything transforms, and that this constant change is not something to resist, but something to understand. From a scientific perspective, this aligns with the nature of the universe itself. Nothing remains fixed. Stars form and fade. Planets evolve. Living systems grow and eventually return to the environment. Change is not an exception, it is the rule. Another calm observation is that the awareness of mortality shapes how life is experienced. The knowledge that time is limited can bring a certain clarity. It highlights what matters, what is worth attention, and what can be let go. This is not about urgency or pressure, but about perspective. When time is understood as finite, even ordinary moments can feel more defined, more complete. There is also a quiet connection between death and rest. During life, the brain is constantly active, processing information, generating thoughts, maintaining awareness. Even during sleep, there is activity, though it changes form. The end of consciousness can be understood as the complete cessation of this activity, not as a state of rest that is experienced, but as the absence of the need for rest altogether. The processes that required rest are no longer active. This perspective removes the idea of struggle. There is nothing to maintain, nothing to hold on to, and nothing to release. The systems that once required effort have simply stopped. But once consciousness is no longer present, the question no longer arises. There is no perspective from which to ask it. This can feel like an incomplete answer, but it is actually consistent with the nature of the question. It is a question that exists only within awareness, and therefore cannot apply outside of it. There is also a quiet simplicity in accepting that not everything requires an answer that fits within human expectations. Some processes are complete in themselves, without needing to be extended or explained beyond their natural limits. Another calming thought is that the end of consciousness is not something that can be anticipated in the way other events are. Anticipation requires time, expectation, and awareness. Without these, there is no sense of waiting or arrival. This removes the idea of death as something approaching from the future. Instead, it becomes a boundary that is only meaningful while life is present. There is also a sense of symmetry in how life begins and ends. At the beginning, there is no awareness of coming into existence. The process unfolds without perception. At the end, awareness fades in a similar absence of perception. This symmetry suggests that the boundaries of life are not experiences themselves, but limits within which experience occurs. Another subtle but important idea is that the absence of experience is not negative. It is not a state of deprivation or loss, because there is no awareness to register it as such. This distinction helps shift the perspective from one of concern to one of neutrality. From both scientific and philosophical viewpoints, the silence beyond death is not something to imagine as a place or condition. It is simply the absence of the processes that create imagination itself. And within that understanding, there is a quiet clarity. The brain, which once generated awareness, has completed its function. The body, which once sustained that activity, has returned to the cycles of nature. The patterns that formed identity and experience have dissolved. What remains is not something to observe, but something that no longer requires observation. A stillness that is not felt. A silence that is not heard. A conclusion that does not need to be experienced to be complete.